Hello there, greetings of the season and welcome to our end of year front page special. We've now been broadcasting for 7 months, which is roughly 4 and a bit times the length of Liz Truss's premiership, and like Westminster politics, the racing landscape has been extremely turbulent, which means there's lots for you to be interested in and to engage with us on. So if you're watching on YouTube, please do like, comment, subscribe and share. Engage with the stories and with our ACE festive season panel. From right to left, Racing Post editor Tom Kerr, senior reporter Chris Cook and Ace Everything, Maddy Playle. Are we all feeling festive and jolly?
No, not yet, really.
Right,
I think we need some like reindeer antlers or something. Might be a nice addition.
Should have got Christmas jumpers on, really.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that would diminish our gravitas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
And
Still further.
We're all about gravitas on this programme. On this particular edition, this bumper hour-length programme, we'll be looking at some of the biggest stories in the racing world this year. Each of us will present one story each, so 4 stories in total that we think have really made an impact on the racing world this year and on you, the viewers and listeners. And then at the end, we will nominate our overall front page story of the year. First up then in this special show is Chris Cook, and you have a Super Sumi story.
Super Sumi, not very super,
Not so super
on this occasion, no. Terrible Sumi, really. I mean, one of the most shocking things I've ever seen on a racecourse, and I've been kicking around for a while now. Of course, this is the eve of Art Weekend. Quiet little Group 3 at Saint Cloud. Sumi sort of stuck out the back and deciding he needs a bit of room as they reach the end of the back straight. More or less barges his way out and sticks his elbow into Ross O'Ryan in doing so. Catches Ross at a vulnerable moment, and the poor jockey gets elbowed out of the plate and tumbles across the turf. I mean, the most amazing thing and extremely dangerous. I mean, you can sort of talk about it with a little bit of lightness now because we know that Rossa got up and he was okay. Fine, but I mean, that could easily have gone the other way. And Christophe Soumillon, very experienced, highly respected, incredibly successful jockey over many years, got a 2-month ban as a result. And, you know, I think it's arguable whether or not that's enough. It's such an incredible, nearly unprecedented thing to see happen that there's really very little context to set it in. You know, it's this sort of act of casual, reckless aggression against one of your fellow riders. Or maybe, I mean, you could take the view that it's actually not that unusual, that you see jockeys, in fact, taking risks with other people's safety on the track quite a bit, and we're just lucky that it doesn't end up this way most of the time. I mean, you could take that view as well. Anyway, it had serious consequences for him. Like I say, he's missed 2 months at the end of the year when he might otherwise have been challenging for another French jockey's title. He's lost his retained job with the Aga Khan. Of course, he's lost that before and got it back, so I mean, it's not out of the question that he'll end up riding for them again someday. He's expressed a lot of contrition, which, you know, I think gets him some of the ground back. I mean, he had a quite long phone call with Ross O'Ryan, and Ross has said afterwards, you know, unprompted by anyone else, that he regained a lot of respect for Sumi as a result of what was said in that conversation. Apparently he's refunded Rafe Beckett, who was the trainer of Ross's mount that day, for the cost of going over there, which is obviously wasted, and he didn't argue about the penalty at all. You know, he sort of took it on the chin right away. So there's a fair bit that can be said in his defence, but it's just a crazy thing to do. And you know, when he gets back in the waiting room, when he's riding in races again, you know, if you're riding against him, you'd have to be looking at him thinking, what's this guy going to do next? Because, of course, we also have that memory from the summer in the Eclipse, when he wins the race on Verdeni, and then, you know, a stride or two past the line, he's sort of looking over at his sons on the rail at Sandown and gives them the gesture, you know, and, you know, accidentally nearly puts 2 of the most valuable horses in the world through the rail. And he got, I think it was eventually an 8-day suspension for that, reduced from a little bit longer on appeal. To have 2 incidents like that in the space of a year is really bad news. I think it needs a bit of explaining. He's always been a bit out there, hasn't he, as a jockey? I mean, he's always been capable of doing stuff that other people would not. There was a very weird celebration at Ascot one time, which I'm sure you wrote about.
Over the bottom?
Yes, he's basically sticking his finger in his bum, if I remember correctly.
Pardon?
I know. The video will be out there, you should see it. And, you know, there's been other sort of, he spoke slightingly of Andre Fabre.
His height.
Yeah, which cost him the job with the Aga Khan in 2009. He does some odd things.
He does do
out
some
of a
odd
blue
things.
sky. And maybe it's not much fun if you're a competitive sportsman to be sharing a sort of arena with a loose cannon like that.
He's one of those people that there are some sports people that you think you'd love to sort of get them on a psychiatrist's couch and really dig deep into them. And he's also unusual because you generally hear that most jockeys normally give the impression that they like each other and that they're well liked themselves. I'm not sure you can say that with Christophe Soumillon. I remember saying to one high-profile British jockey who said to me that he's not widely loved among his peers in the way that other jockeys might be in the weighing room.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much importance I want to put on that because I know what you guys say about me behind my back. I think, you can be a useful person without being popular. But I mean, yeah, it is a little bit odd. Well, it's more than odd, isn't it? It's worrying and dangerous that he's had 2 incidents like that in a year after, 20 odd years of experience riding, when he, out of all the people in the weighing room, he really ought to know better than to be behaving like this. And I think he needs to explain why we should see this as an aberration rather than as a continuing way of behaving.
I was just thinking, if Ross Orion had been a more senior rider, how differently would this have played out? In the last 12 months or so, we've heard that the weighing room is almost in two halves now, isn't there? There's been a bit of a changing of a guard between the senior riders and the younger riders coming through. And I think if that had been a more established rider who perhaps wouldn't have felt the need to protect himself as much, would it have been even more explosive?
I mean, if it had been Kieran Fallon of the old days, then that might have gone very badly for Sumi when they got back to the weighing room. I mean, there's definitely, but then he wouldn't, you sort of sense there are other jockeys he wouldn't have tried that on in the first place. I mean, I think it's maybe because he sees Ross as being a junior guy who should be getting out of his way that he tries something like this in the first place.
I don't think we can overestimate or oversell how big a thing it was at the time. I remember I was in Paris that Friday afternoon and I'd contemplated going to Saint-Cloud that day. And instead I was in a brasserie having an omelette nature and frite, just scrolling through Twitter. And all of a sudden this comes up and you're like, no. And then you look at the video and you're like, no. And then on Saturday at Longchamp, speaking to France Gallot's chief executive, Olivier Deloire, he was sort of giving the impression that France Gallot weren't necessarily completely comfortable with Soumillon riding there. Princess Zara, the Aga Khan's daughter, was making it very clear that his position was under threat, and we knew in the end it was under threat. And there were even people saying at the time, in a situation like this, should a regulator be able to say, straight away, you are not riding. You are now sidelined. Because, of course, the rules are that you have 14 days before a suspension kicks in. I mean, Tom, you were in Paris as well.
It was, yeah. It was an extraordinary story. And it's one of these rare racing stories that transcends the sport entirely. I mean, I had friends text me about it. At St. Pancras, in the queue for coffee, got chatting to someone about the impractical Pret ordering service, but that's by the by. And when I said I was going to the Arc, they said, "Oh, I saw about this fellow who elbowed a jockey off the horse." It got everywhere because it really was one of the most extraordinary things I think you've ever seen. Basically, it could have been very easily so much more serious than it was. It was actually very fortunate that Rosser was not hurt. And the thing that I'm always sort of reflect on with this is had it been worse, what would the punishment then have been? Because surely it wouldn't have been 2 months. Because he could have ended someone's career that day.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
And not just his own.
Well, yeah, then you're talking about, a year span or something like that? But I mean, this could have got even worse because actually the police got involved in the end. The French police, they call the police des jeux, I think is the gaming police, the equivalent of, or we don't really have an equivalent here. And they spent sort of 6 weeks digging around and humming and hawing and thinking about whether they should just put down an order to say his licence was withdrawn indefinitely, which hasn't happened in the end. He's actually able to come back right now if he wanted. I mean, that does feel to me like a lenient suspension. But maybe this is the time of year when any suspension for a flat jockey is going to feel kind of lenient because you've had all the important stuff. I think maybe this is something that racing's regulators have got to take into account is the seasonal aspect of when you're imposing bans. You know, maybe any ban that's dished out in the middle of October to a flat jockey should start to run from the middle of April.
What can't be denied is that he is an outrageous talent. He's an incredibly talented jockey, but he's now at a very difficult situation in his career in that he's lost his Aga Khan job for the second time. He's had this public disgrace. Will Soumillon bounce back again? Because he always has in the past. What do you think, Maddy?
It's hard to say, isn't it? I was just going to say, actually, almost talking about the ban and whether that was right or not, the damage done to his reputation and the loss of the Aga Khan job is almost more of a punishment than the 2 months not riding itself, isn't it? And I think when you look at something like that, you think, well, hang on, can that really be right in the fact that this is not a decision that has been imposed by the regulator, but more by, you know, racehorse connections and owners and trainers and their view? Whether he bounces back, as you've said, Lee, he's clearly got the talent and has the connections to bounce back. And obviously it would have been a very interesting twist if Videni would have won the Arc. I'm not sure what would have happened if that would have came to fruition.
Yeah,
but
I think there might have been some boos from the grandstand. Yeah.
Indeed. Time will tell. We'll have to wait and see. He certainly could, but there are a lot of up-and-coming promising jockeys who will surely be after the same rides and who might look slightly better in the cold light of day as choices to retain.
Do you know, I think it's one of those situations where it'll be like a spur to him, you know. He'll come out in the spring feeling like he's got something to prove, he's got ground to make up. People will be eager to use him, you know, who have horses running against the Aga Khan's horses and thinking this is actually an advantage for us, a problem for them. And he's, you know, we know he's so outrageously good when he's properly on song. It could be quite a productive year next year for him.
And you know, eyes will be on him because he is outrageous. He's outrageously talented as well. And, you know, some sports people are just like that. And they are the ones who are often the most intensely watchable because you are just fascinated by whether they're going to produce a moment of genius or a moment of madness.
Christophe Soumillon is outrageously talented, but there was an even more talented, even more famous jockey who we lost in 2022 in what was a year of significant loss for British racing and racing around the world. And Maddy, that's your story.
Yes, if we're talking about stories that have totally transformed the whole news agenda and reset things as we know it, then the two deaths of Lester Piggott and Her Majesty the Queen have to rank as the biggest stories of the year. Their unfortunate losses have totally just transformed the game, and it's kind of ushering in a new dawn now for a lot of racing fans. They haven't known the sport without the legendary jockey and Her Majesty the Queen, who have two of racing's most beloved characters and icons of the turf, really, not just in this country but over the globe. And you know, in terms of the Racing Post output, it was lengthy, it was detailed, and that was testament to the roles and the regards that they were held in respectively. And we're talking about a jockey who was just a legend in all that he achieved for such a long period of time, and also was such a magnetic character. We talk about the likes of Frankie Dettori, etc. Lester Piggott, really, although I wasn't around and wasn't involved in racing when he was at his best, I can recognise what an outrageous talent he was and everything that he achieved. And the same for Her Majesty the Queen. You know, her association with Royal Ascot, with all her fantastic horses over the years, really in a way that almost acted as the glue to horse racing for a lot of people. And her interest in the sport was a huge drawing point for many. If you look at Royal Ascot, the amount of people who would have been keen to come to see Her Majesty the Queen, and just one of racing's most recognisable faces. So really they should be treated as individuals because they're really that colossal a loss. But together, this really marks a new stage for the sport. And I think we have some questions that we can answer now regarding what is racing going to look like with this new support of the monarch. We've seen the King sell some of his horses, around 40 to 50 horses, I think, and I believe the plan is to cut numbers a little bit, as much as the Queen Consort has an interest and has been. The last time was at Ascot on Champions Day, she was there and clearly has owned horses herself, and that is something that we're going to see continue. But I don't think we can say that Royal Ascot will be anything like the same as it was. And in terms of Lester, that's the end of an era, really, for a jockey of his class and riding style and his story. And are we going to see people? No one could ever fall into those roles, but are we going to see people embrace racing in the same way that they did and really become icons in the same way that they did and attract people from outside the sport as well as in it? We need those names. Obviously the horses do the talking and horse racing is what it's all about, but we also rely a great deal on telling the stories of the characters within it. And in Her Majesty the Queen and in Lester Piggott we had two exceptional human beings who gave so much of their lives to our sport. So yeah, it's an incredibly poignant and pivotal time when we say goodbye to them.
Tom, both Lester Piggott and the Queen had been part of racing story for decades. They're written throughout racing's history books. The Queen was still heavily involved in the sport. John Warren spoke about how the weekend before she died, they were discussing mating plans at Balmoral. She was still actively participating in the sport and thinking about the sport. So she very much was still racing's present. And there's always been that question in horse racing, what happens after the Queen goes? Because she has been, by far and away, racing's pivotal figure, the person who advertises a sport to the world, to non-racing believers more than anybody else. How significant a loss is she in that sense to horse racing? We've had the comfort, if you like, of the royal horses now running in the name of the King. So that is important, I think. They run in the name of the monarch, the King. But we know that the King isn't as interested in horse racing as his mother was. We know that Camilla is, but Camilla isn't the monarch. And we also know that if you move further down the line, there's been no suggestion that the new Prince of Wales has any real interest in horse racing. So have we closed a chapter that racing can never ever hope to repeat in the future?
I think it probably is the end of a chapter in that respect. We're never going to see, certainly not in our lifespans, a monarch like the Queen again, someone with the longevity, with the passion for the sport, and with the global reputation and affection. She was a truly remarkable woman, and she drew people to racing because they were drawn to her. Whether that was individuals who wanted to go to Royal Ascot to see the royal procession, whether it was people who gave racing a chance because of her passion for it, or whether it was owners and Middle Eastern potentates who fancied the chance to hobnob with this true icon of European monarchy. We're never going to see a monarch like her again, in all likelihood. So there's absolutely no chance, I'm afraid, that racing is going to see something quite as similar, quite as profound, something that's quite as long-lived. But what we will see, I think, is a continuation of the royal family's connection with racing. And you mentioned how important it was to see the King racing horses, how important it was as well this summer when we saw other members of the family participating in the royal procession at Ascot. Quite clearly they understand that the connection between the royal family and racing is something important to the identity of the monarchy, to the identity of Britain, and to racing as well. And I think they understand that there's a responsibility there. But I don't think we're going to see King Charles spending hours every day speaking to bloodstock advisors, unfortunately. So in that respect, it is the end of an era, But what a wonderful friend to racing the Queen was, and that's the word we used on her on the day of her funeral on the supplement we produced. And she was a friend, more than a supporter, more than an ally.
How much do you think the sport is going to struggle without, it's still going to be supported by the monarchy, but without that level and intensity and true depth and knowledge and love? How much do you think we're going to suffer for that?
It's a good question. The one thing I think we will see, and this is probably a little bit worrying, is, if you're the future Sheikh Mohammeds of the world, thinking about investing in racing and thinking about investing hundreds of millions of pounds in racing, will you do it in Britain or will you do it somewhere else? I think two things drew people to British racing. The first was the wonderful heritage of the sport, the prestige of it, and the second was the Queen. And without the Queen, maybe they go, do you know what, I'm going to invest all my money in France, or I'm going to invest it in the US or Australia or Japan or whatever.
Well, there are concrete examples of that. If you speak to people who have been connected, say, to the Kipco sponsorship in British racing,
yeah,
they would be completely frank and say that Her Majesty, Her late Majesty, was a significant reason behind that, because the Qatari royal family members were very keen to be in her company at Royal Ascot. That association with the Queen was a huge thing, and that wouldn't be the only commercial deal that indirectly the Queen has been important in securing in British racing. I mean, Chris, is that a significant concern going forward? And I suppose particularly for Ascot, because if there's one racecourse that she's been more associated with any other, it was her own racecourse, Ascot.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a concern if that reality wasn't recognised, but of course it is.
Yeah.
Everybody around the royal family, all their advisors understand that this is the way it is. I'm sure that Royal Ascot will still be Royal Ascot. We will still see the King there for at least part of it. But like this summer, where the Queen wasn't able to attend, and we had a sort of variety of different people in the royal carriages each day. I'm sure the burden of representation of the royal family will be shared around, and I think there's quite a few members of the royal family who have some interest in horse racing, certainly enough to be able to take up the privilege of sitting in the carriage and having a nice lunch and sticking a few quid on a few horses to pass the time. There's a sort of soft power aspect to the royal family which is recognised in government, and Royal Ascot is a great chance to use that, because it's a moment when lots of extremely wealthy, powerful people from around the world can converge in one space and potentially be influenced and told about the great things that Britain has to offer to the world. So I should think the Royal Ascot will carry on much as before, to be honest. The royal representation in racing outside of that is going to change. You are going to see fewer runners. I'm sure the royal studs will be scaled back to some extent. But then part of that is because both of those things were expanded in the Queen's sort of last years or so, because she had such love for the game, and there was this desire to provide her with entertainment, frankly, to provide her with lots of runners. She had more runners and more winners in her last few years than she would normally have had. So there's going to be a natural sort of process of rationalisation, I think. But the royal representation in racing doesn't have to be all about the purple and red silks. There's lots of other ways in which they can support the sport, and I'm sure they still will. That's
right. What could be interesting next year and in the year after is how those silks perform, because I remember John Warren, who I saw the weekend before the funeral, he told this story of how the Queen had come to inspect the yearlings at Windsor in the summer before she died, and driven across, and had told this story of how she'd ridden the day before and she wasn't stiff, and wasn't it marvellous. And John was saying that the current crop of yearlings, he thinks, is the best he's ever known. And there was that poignant aspect that she's actually bred now her finest ever crop of yearlings, and she won't be there to see them race. But there could still be tremendous success, those royal colours, in the years to come. And one other thing that emerged during that conversation with John Warren was that in that weekend at Balmoral before she died, one of the Queen's final racing acts, if you like, was to call one of the owners of Flightline, whose success in the Pacific Classic she'd seen, and she called him, and they spoke about that horse's victory there. And Tom, Flightline is one of the horses that you want to talk about in Story 3.
Absolutely. So on the track, we had a pretty good year in some respects. Also, some respects not so good, but we did get that sort of the stuff we all want to see in racing, which is superstars, And many years can go past, and frankly, there are none, But we've been very fortunate this year, and I think we had 3 horses that either fall into the superstar category or came pretty damn close to it. The first that we saw, I guess, was Constitution Hill, who absolutely smashed the clocks in the Supreme and announced himself as a absolute monster in waiting, and who is basically the headline act of the jump season right now. And hopefully we're going to go on and see him do some pretty amazing things. Then we had Bide, who is probably the best horse since Franco, the best British flat horse since Franco. Went on that fantastic unbeaten run, that glorious win at York, which was so stunning when he stepped up in distance. Obviously, his season ended with a disappointing note at Ascot, but nonetheless, on his achievements, he certainly marked himself out as well above the standard run of champions. And then finally, we had Flightline. That Pacific Classic win was absolutely sensational. There's just something about US oval racing and horses going miles clear that gets the blood pumping. Yeah. And he did it again on Breeders' Cup Classic night. Not quite as impressively, but pretty damn impressively nonetheless. A wonderful way to close a career. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? Unfortunately, 2 of those 3 are now gone to the breeding sheds. I think with Bide, you can say fair enough. Yep. He had a late start to his career, but then had a fairly well campaigned couple of seasons. Flightline did not, and basically, had that Pacific Classic where he announced himself as this massive talent. Breeders' Cup night, it probably was the first time that people who would maybe take a slightly more casual interest in racing were paying attention, and he obviously went out and blitzed it, and then got retired. That was very disappointing because you would have loved to have seen him go to races like the Pegasus, Saudi Cup, Dubai World Cup. He could have raced on, could have done amazing things, but the coal of the breeding shed and the hundreds of millions of dollars that he was worth by that stage probably made that a non-starter. Thankfully, though, Constitution Hill still with us, and hopefully is going to be an absolute superstar. We do want, as we discussed on this show earlier this month, we do very much want to see Honeysuckle give him a proper race, because it would slightly diminish his sort of generational talent if he just has a series of uncompetitive gallops. So we want to see him tested, but what a superstar, something to look forward to, and just great to have these racehorses who can sort of reach beyond the sport, fascinate the followers, but also captivate the casuals.
I sort of found it frustrating with Flightline. I was at the Breeders' Cup, so I spent a lot of that week, explaining to our readers the significance of this American horse who they'd probably only really heard of for the first time when he won the Pacific Classic. And so this was the first time when they could properly be teed up to watch him in a race. And then he wins the race like a superstar, and he's immediately retired. And that's frustrating. That makes you feel like racing is the sport that eats itself. As soon as you created a star, that means the star no longer exists. What I was just looking up there was there was a share in Flightline that went on auction like 2 days later. And I was just looking up the details. It was a 2.5% share in Flightline that sold for $4.6 million after he won that race. I mean, of course, that explains to some extent why he was immediately retired. There are commercial realities. He must have been basically uninsurable.
I think that was it. They said that's one of the reasons. It was insurance costs to keep him racing were many millions, if you even could find an insurer willing to take it on. I mean, so it's not just you're potentially jeopardising the future career, the stud career of this horse, but also it becomes impractical to race on. But that then does feel like something that racing has a vested interest in addressing. Can racing effectively insure these champions to keep them on the track and say, well, race on for another year, you could win a ton of prize money, and if something terrible goes wrong, well, we've got you covered.
Chris, before we move on to Bide, one thing I was particularly interested in is having been in America for that Breeders' Cup, an astonishing performance. We know how difficult things have been for American racing. There's one negative story after another. The New York Times tends only to be interested in racing for a bad news story.
We get some of that here,
we do,
to be honest. Yeah.
Flightline, these comparisons were made with Secretariat, who was America's sweetheart, became a star across America, became a name across America outside of horse racing. Did you get the impression that Flightline had caused even a ripple in the non-racing audience in America?
Yeah, he must have caused at least that, to judge by the coverage that he was getting beyond the sports ordinary sort of territory. But when I was there at Keeneland watching the breeders, I was sort of smack bang in the middle of horse racing, wasn't I? I was in the bubble, so it's hard to be sure that I was getting a real feel for what your average American thinks. I suspect probably the name Flightline is not going to live with them for very long. No. I mean, the thing about Secretariat was, he really was the horse that danced every dance. I mean, he was running like every fortnight for his juvenile career, and then again as a 3-year-old.
Flightline never ran in a single Triple Crown race.
Yeah.
Baid never ran in a classic, and I think that's a big identifier for a lot of people as to how these horses are campaigned. I think I put out on social media afterwards that they were sort of, Flightline obviously had problems as a young horse, and I don't think Baid was 100% straightforward either. But that kind of meant that it took us time to get to know them, and they were trained quite conservatively, understandably so, in the early parts of their careers. I think, yeah. So I kind of think we lost some of that great legacy and great buzz because of that. People weren't instantly recognising them. And I think all of this is just an example of the tail wagging the dog, isn't it, with the bloodstock and racing industries, which is, I hate to sound awfully cynical, but it is a bit of a shame. And I think that is something that we're gonna look back on and sort of wish we'd seen them for a bit longer. And there's this obsession with unbeaten records, isn't there? And I kind of think racing is damaging because of that. But
well, on that one then, Baid doesn't have an unbeaten record. He goes to stud having lost his final race. Did that in any way damage the aura around Baid? Do you three think any less of Baid for the fact that he was beaten at Ascot?
Definitely not, because, I mean, look, there's lots of other examples, but Galileo's the one that comes right to mind. Yeah. They tried something really ambitious with him for his final run. Was it the Breeders' Cup Classic, wasn't it? And he just hated the dirt and ran no race. And no one remembered that, and okay, so then when he goes to stud, you don't know that he's going to be Galileo.
Well, it doesn't change a horse's genetics, does it? Whether they had a disappointing last race.
So, so yes, you go to stud and you get the chance to be, I suppose, probably if you still have that mighty reputation, then you get better mares. I suppose that's where it comes in, your reputation. But the fact is, he succeeded at stud because he was always gonna. I mean, I think, and Baid will get more than a fair chance, won't he, to succeed at stud. If he's going to be a proper sort of mega stallion, then we'll soon find out.
And that's it, isn't it? Basically what's going to determine Baid's reputation post-racing is whether he proves a successful stallion, not whether he had an unbeaten record. But I do think unbeaten records are, they are a problem for racing. It's almost at the stage now you want a horse to be beaten early in its career, so they lose this fear of losing, and then go out and just take on some challenges. Take on some challenges, because ultimately that's what gets people fascinated. It gives you a chance to take a real opinion on the race, and it sets up really engaging, sometimes asymmetrical clashes between horses who have different ability sets. That's what we want to see.
Just to quickly jump in there, I was sat next to John Quinn the other evening at the Gimcrack dinner, and I was talking to him about Highfield Princess. Now, to me, that is a story that in some ways resonates beyond the Baids and the Flightlines. That's, maybe it's just me being a romantic, and the fact that she's coming back for another season. She got beaten off a handicap mark of something in the 50s and went on to that string of grade Group 1s in the middle of the season. And to me, that's almost just as much worth celebrating as an unbeaten horse like Baid or Flightline.
She's a proper charismatic star, isn't she?
Exactly, yeah.
Just before we move on, one last question then with Baid. Through this year in particular, he received these amazing rave reviews. He reached extremely high performance rating numbers and official rating numbers, racing post rating numbers. And there was talk about him, how close he was getting to Frankel in terms of his performances. And we always look in horse racing for that very rare thing, an all-time great. And when we talk about all-time greats, we're talking about Frankels, about Dancing Braves, about Shergars, about Milreefs, Brigadier Gerards. Across the three of you, was Baid an all-time great? Maddy?
No.
Chris?
Yes, an all-time great, yeah.
Tom?
I don't think so.
They're a hard bunch to please, apart from Chris. So, if they were stars who emerged in the horse racing world in recent years, last year or this year, two big stars, two big human stars collided Frankie Dettori and John Gosden, and this is my story. And I will tell you about one of the most dramatic days I have experienced on a racecourse.
It was entertaining days as
It
well,
was very entertaining,
in a
particularly
way.
for a nosy parker such as myself. So after the Gold Cup, well, you watched the Gold Cup, and as soon as it finished, as a journalist, you sort of pretty much knew where the story was. It was around Stradivarius, who had not had an easy passage through the race. He got shuffled back down the home straight first time. He came from a fair way behind. He was yanked out of the home straight and he didn't quite get there. And because we knew what had happened the previous year in the Gold Cup, when John Gosden had been critical of Frankie Dettori's ride on Stradivarius, and because there'd been a hoo-ha after that race on Champions Day at Ascot last year, when you remember Frankie Dettori was critical of Dylan Brown-McGonigal for his ride in the race, you knew that Stradivarius was the place you wanted to go into the winner's enclosure. So there were maybe 3 or 4 of us stood around the area where Stradivarius had come in, and Frankie had dismounted. There'd been applause as he'd come in, and John Gosden, who's a towering figure, walked across to Frankie Dettori and he asked him the question, is there a reason you took him back so far? Now, John Gosden is not stupid. He knew when he asked that question, there were 3 or 4 of us, journalists, with reporting pads and with dictaphones nearby, not right next to them. We weren't, encroaching on their space, but we were close enough that if they said anything loud, we could hear it. He knew that we would hear that and that we would report it. Bjorn Nielsen, who was there as well, Stradivarius' owner, again, he used the line, it wasn't the horse's fault that he got beat. Thereafter, we had TV interviews between John Gosden and ITV, in which he was very obviously critical of Frankie Dettori. A few of us then saw John and Frankie in the weighing room after the race, with Frankie waving his arms in the air, and it was obvious they weren't talking about the quality of the scones in the Royal Ascot Racing Club tea room. It was a heated situation.
I'm sure you were, Lee.
I love a scone. And it became ever more heated the following day, even after Inspire won under Frankie in the Coronation Stakes. And during that moment when she swept to the front, furlong out, the noise was amazing in the grandstand, underlining how big a figure that Frankie is with the racing public. But even after that victory, John again was critical of how Frankie had performed the day before, not just on Stradivarius, but also on the Queen's Saga, who's defeating the Britannia. He blamed Frankie before. It was obvious that things weren't good.
There was the hood on Lord North as well, wasn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. It started very slowly in that race. So things went wrong for Frankie throughout that week. The following week, when it was obvious that we were expecting something, we had news of the sabbatical between the two. That was announced late, I think, on a Friday. The following day at Newmarket, Frankie turned up to ride 1 horse for Rafe Beckett-Lazoo. He hadn't got the rides on the 3 John Gosden trained horses. He came there with a security guard, a security man following him round Newmarket. But Frankie being Frankie, he won on Lazoo. There was a flying dismount. John Gosden had to say how pleased he was for his great mate, Frankie Dettori. And then, a few days later, we had the announcement of the rapprochement. The conscious uncoupling had ended and they were back together again, all lovey-dovey. But I'm not sure how lovey-dovey it was, and it would be surprising if the relationship wasn't strained and impacted to an extent by that. And I thought what was so fascinating by it was the dynamic between these two guys, because in Frankie Dettori you have the world's most famous jockey, the world's most famous racing figure by a country mile. There are very few racing people whose names are known to the general public. He's one of them. But he's also an employee. He works for John Gosden. John Gosden is the boss. And watching their dynamic during that crazy few weeks in the summer was fascinating. It actually, their rapprochement to an extent cost Frankie, because he would have been on pole driver in the King George and ended up riding Emily Upjohn. So to an extent it was quite a costly rapprochement. But they got together. They had a Group 1 win with Emily Upjohn towards the back end of the year on Champions Day. And then more recently, we heard the announcement that Frankie Dettori plans to retire at the end of next year after 1 more year riding for John and Thady Gosden. Tom, you were editing these editions then when this was all happening on the scene. I thought, I can't believe this is going on. This is like a soap opera. What do you make of it?
Well, just from a news perspective, this is the biggest story of the year. Yeah. This story just went tonto. It was unbelievable. You know, it wasn't just one story. Obviously, on the day, as soon as you start putting those quotes out, everyone is gravitating to it because you've got the most famous flat trainer in the country with the most famous flat jockey in the world, and the two of them, who have always been seen as this sort of really powerful alliance, well, at least in recent times, suddenly having this incredibly public, high-profile fallout where they're sort of criticising each other, or certainly John Gosden was criticising Frankie in this sort of trying to do it subtly but not subtly, I think is one way of putting it.
He was trying to do it subtly but not too subtly.
Exactly.
It was a bit of a stage whisper, wasn't it?
Even for the racing press to pick it up. And you know,
we did, to be fair, we did.
Imagine how disappointed he would have been if it had gone unnoticed.
We missed it.
Guys, what I mean is...
but it was just an unbelievable story. The sort of psychodrama between the two of them played out. You know, to your point about the sort of what it told you about their relationship, I think certainly one thing it told you is that this is not in any way, if you ever thought it was, an ordinary trainer-jockey relationship. Oh. The power does not rest as it normally does with the trainer, but rather you can see that both of them have some quite remarkable levers to pull of their own, basically, can you?
Yeah. Were you surprised, Maddy, that the sabbatical was so short?
I was. It kind of made us all feel a bit silly, really, didn't it? Because one minute we were talking about how they'd had this high-profile split, and then the next minute nothing's changed and it's all fine.
But is it fine?
Well, there we are. But of course they did unite again for Group 1 success. But of course we've got to remember this is taking place, this is the main story, but this is taking place on a background of a lot of jockey-trainer relationships breaking down. Sylvester de Sousa lost his King Power retainership. He's now running in Hong Kong. We had Ross Orion and Amo Racing, who again reunited after their debacle. So it's just fascinating, isn't it, for a racing fan, for the press, for spectators to watch about how these dynamics work. And it's almost a power struggle between two incredibly strong forces. But I think that those relationships, we might see some changes in how they work in the coming years. You know, traditionally, trainers and owners have had the final say and have had the power. Whether it comes down to actually written contracts or something else.
That must still be the case, mustn't it? I mean, if you look at a guy like Frankie, who, you know, sort of unquestionably the most famous flat jockey riding around and has been that way for as long as I can remember, and yet, you know, he gets treated like that.
And we didn't hear too much from his corner, did we?
He didn't really push back hardly at all, no. At least not in public. It made me feel sadly, because the context of this for me was, just before the start of the flat season, I watched again that movie, I think it's just called Dettori, isn't it? The Dettori movie, which makes him look great, and it's a very enjoyable watch, actually. But there's this quite moving scene in the middle of it where he remembers, you know, after he had the fallow period, it would be about 10 years ago, and he was down to like a dozen winners in the whole year in Britain. And it looked like the sport was just moving on without him. And he sort of had the partial revival with Sheikh Fahad. Sheikh Joanne, beg your pardon. But then he gets the call from his old mate John Gosden, which was sort of the beginning of this amazing revival and Golden Horn and winning derbies and arcs.
I've got a plan.
Yeah, yes. And so he sits there and he remembers the phone conversation, you know, word for word, and it brings a tear to his eye. And you know, it really seemed like a sort of, you know, just a key moment in his entire life.
Well, it gives us the opportunity.
It's like literally a life-saving moment.
To delve into the characters of who these people actually are a bit more, doesn't it? In terms of Dettori is actually quite a sensitive guy, I think, when you get down to it. We see this bravado and the showmanship, but also there's a human within it and an emotional one at that. And the same with John Gosden, in that he has that inner steel. You know, often he comes across as this incredibly charismatic trainer and speaks so beautifully. But I think this was just a great opportunity to really get under the skin of some of racing's biggest players, which is not something we often see in flat racing.
To that point, and perhaps Lee, you're best placed to answer this. What was going on with John Gosden? What was in his mind when all this was happening?
I think what he wanted to do was give his jockey a public dressing down. I I think from things that were said afterwards, I think John has pretty much gone public on this himself.
Yeah.
He had tried in the background to, in his way, change Frankie's mindset. He felt that Frankie's mind wasn't on the job of being a jockey enough, which in some ways is interesting, because they had previously been very much in agreement that this relationship worked because Frankie was treated as a part-time jockey. He wasn't someone who was going to be sent to Brighton or Leicester or Nottingham. Frankie used to joke. I remember being down at Clarehaven one morning for an interview, and Frankie was joking about his absolute ambition not to go beyond 200 rides in Britain in a year. He was to ride very selectively. And John, to be fair, John Gosden had been very good at managing him in that regard. He had resurrected Frankie, so there's no doubt John Gosden resurrected Frankie Dettori's career, and he'd been very good at managing him in that sense. But it seems that this year, something changed. There was clearly disappointment, I think, that Frankie went to Italy for a wedding the week before Royal Ascot. That I don't think went down particularly well. And John was very open in saying afterwards that he wanted Frankie to be more focused on the job in hand, to return to being a jockey more. But it was interesting that he felt to achieve that, he had to be very public about how he felt.
There was some frustration about results as well, wasn't there? I mean, the Oaks has got to be part of this.
Yeah, it was a bad day.
With the Emily Upjohn getting beat when probably realistically she shouldn't have been beaten in that race.
And I think that's important, because if you are riding as a part-time jockey, and if your job, if the trainer's employing you purely to perform on the big days, and that person believes that you're not performing on the big days, and your raison d'etre disappears.
Yeah. I mean, and that, again, that just makes me sad because, okay, so it's gone a bit wrong on them, but, you know, for so long this was a good news story, the two of these guys turning up in the big days and hitting it out of the park, and then you're left with this feeling that these guys who should have been friends for life, and you know, there should have been a period of 20 years when at least one of them was in retirement and they were still mates, and you know, there's probably not going to be now. I mean, they're going to have a very different relationship when Frankie stops riding.
Well, let's hope the final year is a good year for them both. And Tom, you were saying that this was by far the biggest news story of the year for horse racing. How big a story will Frankie's final year be? We've got this farewell tour that's going to go from probably California up one side to California at the other, ending at the Santa Anita Breeders' Cup with a few global stop-offs in between, probably on at Brighton, Nottingham or Leicester. How big a deal is that for horse racing?
Well, it's huge, isn't it? And you've got to love it. How Frankie to do a year-long lap of honour. We thought McCoy's retirement was lengthy, but this blows out of the park, and that's absolutely classic Dettori. You know, that's what we're going to lose with him. He is the consummate showman, whereas a lot of jockeys, perfectly understandably, are quite, you know, they're quite retiring. They often do not seek the limelight. Frankie thrives on it. He feeds on it. And he has become racing's most bankable star as a consequence. So the next 12 months or through to the Breeders' Cup, when he's going to stop, will be a rolling cavalcade of the Dettori circus. But it won't be a simple one, I think we can safely say. There will be a few surprises along the way. There will be a few arguments or controversies. You know, it would not be Frankie Dettori if the next 10 months is all straightforward and lovey-dovey, would it?
What odds are we offering on a U-turn by the end of the year?
Yeah, it's not out of the question, is it?
You could imagine if a brilliant horse came along, he could, on that final day at the Breeders' Cup, lead a chant of one more year. You know?
You say that, although he did make the point. I interviewed him the week of the retirement, and one of the things he was pointing out to was he was feeling poorly because he just had a COVID booster jab, which explained he could have as an over 50. And I think he was very much aware at that point that he isn't quite the young buck he used to be. But he's still the biggest star in horse racing for one final year. And as I say, that moment when Inspiral swept by into the lead at Royal Ascot, that was one of the biggest noises made on a British racecourse this year. It was a great moment for the sport. but there have been some pretty bad ones in 2022 as well. And this is our final story, our overarching story, our big front page story of the year, and that is troubles in horse racing, and particularly in British horse racing, it has to be said. The white paper looming following the gambling review. We don't know at this stage quite what will be in it, and I know people within the BHA are nervous about being too complacent because they're well aware there could be surprises in there, but we're pretty sure there will be affordability checks within that legislation, and there already are affordability checks.
I think this is the crucial point here. The white paper's delay is no longer become a problem because we don't know what's going to happen. It's because what we feared would happen with the white paper has happened.
Yeah.
And it has happened by stealth rather than the government, whatever you think about them, proposing things like affordability checks. The regulator, the Gambling Commission, completely unaccountable, has just decided, let's implement them anyways. And this month, we have run a series of articles which has given us, for the first time, I think, some grasp of just how big the impact of that has been. The estimated hit to turnover on British horse racing, this is by ARC Chief Executive Martin Cruddas, is £800 million. That, in terms of a percentage decline for them, is almost a quarter. That is absolutely huge. The income hit that it causes to racing is estimated at around £40 million. And racing cannot afford to lose £40 million. But the worrying thing is, these affordability checks are not something that, it's a one and done. It hits everyone straight away. People hit them over time. They have one more account basically shut down because they're not willing to provide their birth certificate and tax returns for 20 years to some bookmaker representative. Therefore, they slowly get squeezed out. And some of them go to the black market, some of them just stop betting entirely. But the consequences for racing are very, very real already, and they are very, very profound. It's hugely worrying, and hopefully when the white paper does come out, what it will actually do is give some clarity about what the government thinks an acceptable form of affordability checks is, assuming they do go for them, which sounds like they will. And the Gambling Commission then falls into line, provides bookmakers some clarity, and hopefully operate slightly more sensible checks which don't scoop up quite such a vast number of racing punters.
Maddy, Chris, you're both enthusiastic and successul punters. Maddy,
how do you know that?
Chris probably is. I'm not sure that's the successful part for me.
I've got faith in you both.
You didn't include me in that, Lee.
You're above such things. Maddy, if your bookmakers that you bet with start saying to you, we want to see details of your pay slips, your bank accounts, information like that, how concerned would you be? Would that put you off?
Absolutely. I mean, there's two elements to this, and by the way, certain checks are already in place, and have led to the demise of several of my betting accounts. The first one is purely from an effort perspective. Submitting these documents is not easy, and the amount I've sent in pictures of my driving license or etc. and it's not been accepted, and I've sent it twice and it's not been accepted, and you just kind of go, well, I'm just not going to bother. Certainly for the level that I bet at anyway. So it's that.
You need to ramp it up then, Maddy, make it worth your while.
It's going to that amount of effort, I think, turns a lot of people off. But also, just on a moral, ethical level, it's incredibly intrusive. And I don't think that people should necessarily have such detailed access to my personal life. And I think that's a concern lots of people share.
I agree with that, but there is a feeling that that's the way the modern world is going. I mean, this isn't the only example where you're asked for material that you'd rather not send electronically.
Well, it is the only example, though, when you are spending your own money.
Yeah, I mean,
we
are no other.
I'm not justifying it all, but I mean, I'm just saying, it feels like everything has to be done electronically. Like I'm communicating with my bank over my blooming phone, and I'd much rather not be doing that for security purposes. But look, if it came to it for me, yes, I probably am going to provide anything that I'm asked for because, it's my life now, isn't it? And it's my work, and I'm just bound up in it, and I can't not have a betting account.
But if
exactly. If I wasn't so embedded in the sport, I think, I would reach my limit very quickly where I go, well, sod you, I'm not giving you that. I'm not to some firm that might be registered in the Dutch Antilles or wherever. There's just no way. I mean, you could go back to being a cash punter in the betting shop, couldn't you?
And the worrying...
If betting shops exist, we're seeing the demise of them as well.
2,000 fewer of them.
The worrying thing as well is again, how gambling is being represented and presented by such a wide group of people, not just politicians, but journalists, commentators. Yeah, and it's not just here either. There's been legislation in Ireland too that has severely put curbs on.
I think there's an element to this that the type of people who generally become legislators or MPs are also, there's a very strong crossover with the type of sort of moralising people who think anyone who gambles is a victim, and they need to be protected from themselves. Well, actually, we all know that's not the case. That many people gamble because of enjoyment, because of the intellectual challenge, because it's a way to engage more thoroughly with a sport they enjoy. And we know that not all gambling is the same type. I think they see any type of gambling as basically analogous with problem drinking or smoking cigarettes. It is bad for you, that's it. And therefore, it's the state's responsibility to try and ensure that they minimise the degree to which you gamble, drink, smoke, whatever. And that's what they're trying to do. So that is based, for me, on a fundamental misunderstanding of what gambling is, but also a complete lack of respect for the people who do gamble, which is millions of people across Britain put a bet on and enjoy the process of doing that. They enjoy it when they win. They obviously enjoy it slightly less when they lose, but it is part of it, and they are not being taken advantage of. They're not idiots. They're just people who enjoy betting. And it's very worrying to me that politicians do not seem to appreciate that, and that we are heading down a route where we are effectively heading closer and closer towards prohibition. And
I think what the BHA is particularly worried about, I know what Joe Sommer-Smith, the BHA chair, is particularly worried about, is unintended consequences from any legislation. He says he speaks to politicians and they're all adamant, we don't want to do anything that damages British horse racing, but they don't necessarily understand what could cause damage to British horse racing. Yeah. And even if affordability checks are set at relatively low levels and the government opts for unobtrusive checks, there's doubts about whether you can actually do that. Whether technology is there to do it that way, whether even if the government sets a low bar, that punters will still have to send in P60s and bank statements and pay slips.
There's also an irony to this, in that if people stop betting through bookmakers, then they're going to turn to the black market anyway, potentially.
It's hard to think of a less safe environment for people to gamble in. Yeah, it was a classic, like any type of government prohibition of something that everyone does and has done for time immemorial. It will not work. The human drive to gamble will always be there, and it will simply take place on the unregulated side of things, whether that's betting with people through WhatsApp or using dodgy websites registered in the Dutch Antilles. Two references in one show for the Dutch Antilles, that's got to be a record. That's what people will do. Yeah. That's simply what will happen.
And that means no tax from that betting
No
either.
Tax from that, nothing going to the Exchequer, nothing going to British racing, people being exposed to completely unscrupulous operators. It's a recipe for complete disaster.
Just opening up a little bit, obviously the big worry for racing obviously is that most people get into racing because of betting. We should never be snobbish about that. It's a betting sport. We love it for the horse in the racing as well, but for a lot of people it's a vehicle for punting, and that's to be celebrated. But for racing in that sense, we don't want to lose fans, but there are already fears that we're losing fans. If you look at racecourse attendances in 2022, it's been a story of numbers going down. Those numbers have gone down. Look at field sizes. Those numbers have gone. If I was at the dispatch box now, I'd be rattling off a list of all these things, and you'd be saying down, down, down. There'd be a chorus of. It's been one-way traffic.
You can pile all these things up and really scare yourself, can't you? I mean, I think particularly when you get to attendance, you have to take that away from the conversation we've just been having. I think that's really related quite closely to the times that we're living in, i.e. post-COVID. People are, a lot of people are still worried about that. They are, and they're short of money. Yes, the older people definitely, and more vulnerable people. And they're also short of money.
Absolutely, and that will get worse.
And they are rationing themselves in terms of, you know, when they go out and spend a lot of money and have a big ballyhoo. So you see them on the big days. And the Cheltenham Festival, you know, you were there this year.
Yeah.
That was just completely mad because no one had been there the year before, and it was like it was a jailbreak. You know, there was hedonistic behaviour, and it was quite good fun. But then you get to sort of much more ordinary bread and butter day at Hereford, and you know, people just don't turn up like for that, even in the way that they used to. So, you know, an average of 4,000 has gone down, you know, sort of 10-14% for a lot of these smaller meetings, and smaller Saturdays as well. You can hope that that will come back. We sort of need the economy to turn a corner, and God knows when that's going to happen. But I do think, yeah, I'm sure it's in people's mind, particularly the older generation on which racing has often relied for its attendance. You know, some of those people have never really recovered their confidence about going out and joining in big crowds again.
And it's a vicious circle, isn't it? Because if you've got fewer and fewer horses running in these races, fewer and fewer people turn up, and it's harder then for people like us, the racing media, for ITV, for Racing TV, for Sky Sports Racing, to sell those events, which means fewer people bet on it. It all goes round and round and round. If we look to the future, are there reasons to be hopeful? In Britain, there is a new governance system in place now, with the BHA board having the ultimate power over decisions going forward, and we have got strategy conversations going on all the time going into next year. And Julia Harrington, the BHA Chief Executive, has been adamant in saying that the first priority is to deal with the racing product, to try and get better field sizes, to get more competitive racing, so that people do want to engage with the sport. Maddy, does that make you hopeful for 2023?
I often find when we have these conversations, Chris is the one to go for to more balanced, hopeful arguments, and I can tend to be rather
blue
more...
skies, does Chris?
Yeah, I can rather be more cynical. To be quite honest with you, we've heard so much about racing's problems, and we've also heard a lot about what racing's going to do about them, and how that stretches into 2024 and these strategy reviews. I'm just a bit fed up about it, to be honest. I want to see that change rather than to be talking about the prospects of it. So for me, I think it's hard to be confident in racing's future right now. You need to see material changes to the way it's run. And, you know, just last month I was finding a story about how field sizes have yet again plunged. I think we just need to see it now is the time to see change rather than talk about it and hope for it. It's getting to such a dangerous place, and I worry. I really worry for the future of the sport.
Chris, Maddy right, are you our eternal optimist?
I mean, maybe that's just the experience of, you know, betting on horses. You know, if you stare at a 16-runner Class 6 handicap for long enough, you know, eventually you really fancy one.
We don't get those anymore, Chris.
Yeah, well, yeah, 16 runners, pie in the sky. Yeah, I mean, Maddy's right. You know, it'd be great to see some change, some progress. You know, it takes us so long to do anything. I mean, and look at the whip rules, you know, which have just been rewritten and are newly the subject of controversy. I mean, that's been 4 years in the making. A set of rules which, you know, 1 month before they're due to be implemented, suddenly all the jockeys are coming out and saying, you know, this isn't going to work. How have we not managed to get that right in the time available?
Yeah.
It's just a total lack of confidence, isn't there, in the whole.
And cohesion, yeah, we're never all facing in the same direction. Our interests are never aligned, and there's no hope. No, of course there's hope. I mean, I'm encouraged by the strategy meetings, and some people are making the right noises about, yes, okay, we all have to take our even share of the pain, but you got to believe it when you see it.
What do you think, Tom? Do you see a page being turned?
I think what we got this year, which is good, is a better acceptance and appreciation of what ails racing than we've had for a long time. You know, things like the governance structure, I know it's boring, but by God, it was completely paralysing the sport, and they've overhauled that. Is the new governance system perfect? No. Does it give us a shot at dealing with those problems? Yes. However, the big hurdles which still have to be overcome is the fact that power is so distributed in racing, and self-interest, as much as it's a dirty word, is perfectly understandable and will come to the fore again, that actually enacting some of the changes which we need to see in order to address the problems is going to be very, very difficult. So is there hope? Yes. Would you be optimistic? Perhaps slightly more tempered.
well, it's something, isn't it? A degree of hope is better than no hope at all. And
Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas. Talking about hope, what do we hope to see in this wonderful new year? Team, either one aspiration that you've got for the new year, one anti-post bet that you are confident will deliver you victory, a certainty for 2023, Maddy.
Oh no, I was wishing you wouldn't go to me first. I feel like after that discussion I can't just throw out an anti-post tip and hope for the best. I've got to think of something more meaningful. I've had a couple of bets this year, and one of them, the most recent one, is 40-1, so I might as well sit with that and hope that it comes to fruition. Obviously it's a long shot, but we like to take risks rather than play it safe. And the horse in question is We've All Been Caught for Nigel Twiston-Davies in the Albert Bartlett Novices Hurdle. You remember he finished
a proper tip that.
Yeah, well, he finished a running on effort behind Hermes Allen in a Cheltenham race, was due to run the last meeting, I believe, over 3 miles. This was a really talented bumper horse. And has just been shaping like he's a real talent. The trainers actually compared him to Imperial Commander, his Gold Cup winner. And I'm sure we're going to be usurped by some incredible Irish hope. But I hope that Nige and Sam can have a great horse in We've All Been Caught. And I just think he's too big a price. But not one to bank on anyway.
so Maddy's gone for a 40-1 shot, which basically means looking for 50s or more from you, Chris. Unless you can deliver something like world peace. Or
I think I've already tipped Lifetime Ambition for the Grand National, which must be bigger than 50-1 now because it's run a couple of races that make you think it's got no chance. I think basically now I'm waiting for the betting to come out on the top of him because he's not going to stay 4.5 miles. So look out for that whenever they start betting on that race.
Tom.
As an anti-post tip for a race that you can't even bet on right now, so that really took
not much use, is it really?
I was going to tip Edwardstone for the champion chase, but then I went on and checked his price, and it's very skinny. So finally getting the respect he deserves. So instead, I'm going to say for something I hope to see. I hope in the new defining class of the Cheltenham Festival, that is Willie Mullins versus the whole of Britain.
Yeah,
we see Britain doing a little bit better this year.
Well, we shouldn't forget we won the first 3 races this year. They stopped the clock there.
Absolutely.
We're away. We're successful. I'll just say then, if we're talking about the Cheltenham Festival, I would love to see Queen's Gamble win the champion bumper for Oliver Shew.
I've got a hope and a desire regarding the Cheltenham Festival.
Desire?
Because I sort of keep track of odds-on runners at the Cheltenham Festival recently, because I find it a real pain and very depressing. There's so many of them. We're averaging 5 a year. So what I would hope is that when we actually get to the greatest race meeting of all, I'd like to see not any, but we've got Constitution Hill, so as long as he actually turns up, there'll be 1 odds-on fav, won't there? But it'd be lovely if he was the only one in the whole week.
There might be 5 on the first day.
Yeah, it could, and they might all win. Yeah,
it is the greatest race meeting in the world, of course, isn't it? The Cheltenham Festival. We all love it, and although at times our discussion might seem quite bleak, we do love this sport as well. We also love the Racing Post app. It is a thing of beauty, and if you download our new app, you will find exclusive content from the biggest names like Tom, Chris and Maddy, free daily tips from our star tipping lineup, like Tom, Chris and Maddy. And you'll get all the finest content in every possible way. Thank you for watching this. I was and still am Lee Mottershead. Thank you to Tom Kerr, to Chris Cook, to Maddy Playle. We wish you the most wonderful 2023 and ask that you join us every Monday for the front page. Until those come along, bye-bye.